Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Carson. I'm the Senior Director of Strategic Business Development for DECRA Business Assurance. Happy to be presenting our ISO 45001 overview webinar today. Today's webinar, we're going to basically do an overview of the recently released ISO 45001 standard. While this is a new standard, it does adopt many concepts from the OHSAS 18001 standard. Our focus is largely going to be on the content of ISO 45001 today, but we will get into some transition tips for those currently certified to OHSAS 18001. We will have a webinar later this year that will focus more specifically on transitioning from OHSAS 18001 to ISO 45001, which we're finalizing the dates on, and we'll send out more information to all of you shortly. So you know, just a couple housekeeping items. Everyone is on mute. So if you do have any questions, please type them in the question box on the right-hand side. We'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, and we'll try to get through all the questions time willing, but if we don't, we will respond individually to your questions as well. In regards to the first question, we're likely to get, yes, the presentation is being recorded, and we will send a copy to everyone along with the supplemental information that we're providing with this as well. So let's get started. Some of you may be new to DECRA and others have worked with multiple DECRA entities. So the question is, who are we? Like many large companies in what we call the TIC industry, which is testing, inspection, certification, and has now gone more towards training, testing, inspection, certification, and consulting, our roots are overseas. We were founded as an automotive inspection agency in Germany in 1925. Our mission statement then is the same as today. We're a global partner for a safe world. We ensure safety on the road, at work, and at home. DECRA is comprised of multiple business lines. We've put them under the overall umbrellas of automotive, industrial, and personnel. This gives you a little bit of what all we have as far as business units. And within that, you can see some very obvious connections to safety, as we have behavioral safety consulting, process safety testing, and of course, safety management systems, which is the topic of this webinar today. But if you look at safety in a broader sense than just looking at individual safety, you'll see our services really extend the definition to keeping your businesses safe. One of the organizations under DECRA, of course, is Business Assurance. That's my group, as I mentioned before. And we work in multiple standards and disciplines. What we provide is certification, training, and assessment services to help customers meet stakeholder requirements, develop new markets, reduce or mitigate risk, create a culture of continuous improvement. And you can see some of the more popular ISO or ISO-based standards that we work with. And when we really look at it, obviously we have a standard occupational health and safety that addresses safety very explicitly. It really extends to risk reduction, mitigation in a number of areas. One of the biggest areas that all the standards have moved to in the recent years is having a knowledge and a risk-based approach attached with it, embedded into the system. So getting a little bit into the history of occupational health and safety standards. OHSAS 18001 was first published in 1999. It was never actually accepted as an ISO standard, but it did align with many of the ISO standards. And then in July 2007, they did a little bit more to align it with the framework of other management system standards. October 2013, that's when the first working draft of ISO 45001 was created, and it used 18001 as a blueprint. So there were things that are still, you know, common concepts that you'll kind of see more as we get into the presentation that are still in place within the 45001. But once 45001 got published in March of this year, they did switch the structure to align with the Annex SL model, which I'll get into, which really was designed to provide the ability within multiple standards to align them more closely so that you weren't looking at running a quality management system completely separate from your environmental management system, completely separate from your health and safety management system. So what is a health and safety management system? The real focus of a health and safety management system is to address issues through awareness and assessing any applicable legal requirements, identifying potential hazards and risks, and reducing or mitigating their impact, assigning the responsibilities for who's really responsible for making the system work, controlling it, making sure everyone's aware, ensuring that there's appropriate controls and monitoring in place to make sure that the system is always effective, being improved, reviewed on a continual basis, and developing and implementing emergency response capabilities to limit or control these hazards. Benefits to business. One of the benefits is it's a proven systematic approach to managing risks and hazards. Also has a proof of proactively addressing both existing and potential risks and hazards. That's one of the things when you look at these standards, that they're not just saying, what do you know that is definitely a risk, but what else could be out there, that it's getting a methodology and structure in place. Risk reduction, both in legal liability and accidents, competitive edge. One of the things that is very beneficial for any kind of management system standard is that you're getting outside people to come in and look. So you're getting a fresh set of eyes so that you're not going into groupthink, that you've got outside people looking at how you do it, getting that improvement, feedback, all that. That's a competitive edge, but it's also a competitive edge in that, many standards are a requirement to do business with certain companies. And companies also use that improved image, as we said. If they're, really showing that they're proactively addressing their issues, it does show very well for the company. So just a quick little touch on the OHSAS 18001 structure. So as you see, it was really 4 sections which had scope, references, terms and definitions, and then section 4 was the actual requirements. Getting into the actual requirements, you see all the things that it talked about as far as the general requirements, policy, objectives, targets, responsibility, training, controls, how you evaluate yourself, internal audits, management review, all of these areas. So ISO 45000 has those same areas, but in a little bit of different sequence. So that you still see there's still the scope, references, and definitions in the first 3 sections, but then the remaining 7 sections get into the plan, do, check, act model. So on the plan, you see context of the organization, leadership, planning, support. Do is the operation, check is the performance and evaluation, act is a continual improvement. One of the things that when you look now with the new structure for these ISO standards is that they are largely structured very similarly with, a couple tweaks here and there, but obviously the biggest section is the operational part as it will apply to quality, health, safety, environmental, those kind of areas. Going a little bit deeper, we see kind of the closed loop cycle for health and safety management system. So you see, you set your policy, and then from that, you identify your hazards, you bring in participation of the people within your company. That helps you set objectives and plans, bringing in, looking at legal and other requirements. Then, determining the support needed. What are the resources needed? What are the competence? How do we communicate this? How do we document? How do we capture what we're doing? Then getting into the operational planning and control, which that really focuses on how to eliminate hazards and risks, or at least mitigate them, how you manage change in addressing any of these, how procurement goes into, plays a part as well into the system. Performance and evaluation, which is monitoring and measurement, evaluating compliance, doing internal audits, then doing a management review on your system, and that cycles back to continual improvement, and you make any adjustments through the system. So getting into the clauses, clause 4, as we talked about, context of the organization. So this is something that's a little different now in the field of ISO. That's one of the new clauses that has really come in that people are kind of trying to get an idea of what that means. Context of the organization is really providing a high-level understanding of the issues that affect the way you manage your health and safety management system for your people. Now, those issues basically include the conditions, characteristics, or changing circumstances, variables, anything like that that may affect the system. So, looking at those issues, the issues are broad. There's external issues. Those external issues, obviously, those outside the doors of your business. Now, those could be cultural, social, political, what the market's doing, technology, economic, trends and indicators, all those things are examples. It's not all inclusive of just some of the things that you may want to look at as far as external issues that affect your management system. Internal issues. So these are within your own, walls, and so it's everything from governance to, your policies and objectives, resource capabilities, products, processes, raw materials, equipment, your culture, the own standard and guidelines that you put forward as well. As I said, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just examples of some of the more common areas that typically fall under internal issues for consideration. Other interested parties. So when it talks about other interested parties, these could include a lot of the ones that we've talked about with, both in internal and external. Legal requirements, parent organizations. You can have other interested parties that if you're part of a larger company, then they have an interest in things that are going on within your management system. Your suppliers may have interest. There may be things within the community, and your customers, of course. As we said, one of the things that does drive management systems is customer requirements. It's important to know that these requirements from interested parties, they become the requirements for an organization if you choose to adopt them. If you choose to adopt them, then they become organizational requirements and should be considered when planning and establishing the management system. Talks about the scope of the organization. So the organization does have the freedom to define its boundaries. Now, it can implement within the whole organization or parts of the organization, but it needs to account for all activities, products, or services within its control that are going to impact the performance of the management system. And it needs to be factual and representative of what you're actually doing from an operational standpoint. Leadership. That's clause 5. This is moving around some of the other things that you see from the previous 18,001, but does have a couple differences for that. The thoughts behind leadership is that top management support is critical, from being committed, supporting, providing responsiveness, resources, all those things to make the system work. It's incumbent upon leadership that they communicate in addressing why this is important for the workers and how their worker buy-in will lead to better acceptance, better implementation, and make it more, as we said, relevant to actually what's going on in the company. Now, the requirement also goes to state that you need to have a representative with the authority to ensure that the system is established, that it's implemented, and it's maintained, and then report to top management on the performance of the system and opportunities for improvement. That's as we talked about with the continual improvement in the loop of the process that goes back in once you've had internal audits, you have management review, and you talk about opportunities for improvement. So it's all within the representative to ensure the establishment, implementation, and maintenance of that. Key thing for leadership too is to provide all the resources needed to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the system and its performance. And by resources, it can be people, it can be finance, it can be infrastructure. All those things is what they're looking for commitment from the leadership. So when we talk about things that top management should do, number one is create and promote a positive organizational culture. Provide health and safe working conditions for workers. And most importantly, as we said before, encourage the participation of workers in the development, implementation, and maintenance of the system, including suggestions for improvement and to feel safe from threat of reprisals. We've worked with many companies as far as certification to management systems, and I would say almost without fail, the real success stories are the ones that really have it to where, yes, we have a management team, but we're really bringing in the participation of everybody, that it's not just leadership, it's the people on the lines, it's sales, it's production, it's everyone, it's clients, it's any kind of contractors, that it's, trying to bring in everyone to really make the system as representative of what you're doing, but also improve it to make it the best that it can be. We talk about, worker participation, and so there are barriers, to that. And these are things that you should look to address when trying to set up your management system. Lack of information. Why are we doing it? Lack of training. That we have it, but we don't know why, or we don't know what. And then time and resources. That's the thing that every company runs into. And even, the mechanisms for cooperation, between management and non-management, those need to be in place. A lot of times there's unawareness. You don't know what the hazards and risks are, and sometimes that does go back to the training for that and the information on objectives, and just the communication of the objectives. Sometimes it's a culture that there is a fear of reprisal, that we don't feel comfortable in our organization providing feedback that will actually help drive a better system. And a culture that doesn't, promote or support occupational health and safety. That goes back to the leadership, that if the leadership isn't establishing a culture that promotes and supports it, that's an issue, again, for bringing the workers in to participate in the system. Clause 6 gets into planning. So planning. So the purpose of planning is to prevent undesired effects. This is done by looking at hazardous events, really saying, what's the likelihood, what's the consequences, and identify opportunities that can improve performance. So planning is not a single event, but an ongoing process, anticipating changing circumstances and continually identifying risks and opportunities. Now, how you identify the risks and opportunities is, largely up to the organization to say, hey, this is what we feel, is more likely. A lot of times they'll score it on, likelihood, consequences. Is this something, how likely is it? What's the potential risk? Taking those two factors and saying, okay, these are the ones too that we are really going to focus on because likelihood's high or the risk is very high. Hazard identification, risk assessment, determination, and control. This is really saying, what are the hazards, as you talk about? What are the hazards? What controls are in place? And then how do you rate the risks and significance of them as far as occurrence and also what you can control? Examples of hazards. So hazards can come from various sources: machinery, chemicals, radiation, workload, even just behavior of people. The situations can be an example of hazards, working at heights, working in confined spaces, working in solitude or fatigue. Hazard can be categorized in many ways. Some of them include, as we said, physical, chemical, biological, physiological, psychological, mechanical, and electrical. So from this, we say, how do we do a risk assessment? And we said before, an organization may use different methods to assess risk. There's not a right or wrong answer. It's that it should be appropriate to the type of risk being considered. The complexity doesn't depend on the size of the organization, but the hazards associated with the activities within the organization. So what that really means is that whether you're large or small, it depends on what you do and the potential risks there are. You might have many potential hazards and risks, but then there's only, you can only maybe say these are the ones that we really want to focus on for what we are looking to control, what we can control. The risk assessment determines the levels of the risk and enables the organization to identify the appropriate controls. Purpose of the system should always be to achieve safe and healthy working conditions with a level of residual risk which is as low as reasonably practical. So residual risk is a risk remaining after appropriate preventative and protective measures can be taken. So the thought behind it is you're probably never likely to reduce all risk, but at least look at after we've taken these measures and set these plans, objectives, and all this, have we put it where the risk is at the lowest residual level possible? Awareness and assessment of the legal requirements. So how are legal requirements identified by your company? What are they? And how are those requirements linked to your hazards? One thing that I can definitely say is that any legal requirements should be something that you're looking at as a very significant risk and hazard because of the fact that it's a legal requirement, and it's incumbent upon your system to address it that way. When we get into legal and other requirements, legal requirements can be legislation, as we talked about that, statutes, code of practices, directives, permits, licenses, judgments of courts, treaties, conventions, protocols, collective bargaining agreements. All these things may be legal requirements that you have to consider. Other requirements, company requirements, contractual conditions, agreement with employees, agreement with health authorities, non-regulatory standards, consensus standards, guidelines, voluntary principles, codes of practice, technical specifications, charters, public commitments of the organization. So what you're saying you're going to do as an organization to the community at large also can be a requirement that you want to look at within your risk assessment. So then within that, we get into establishing the objectives and targets. And that's really saying, okay, what is there in place? Who's responsible? What's the time frame? So it's really assigning responsibility for actions, having it that it's very clear, very measured, very targeted, and that it's reasonably actionable on a specific time frame. Objectives for health and safety management systems really fall into three areas. One is strategic. So that's simply looking to improve the overall performance of the organization. For example, improving the health and safety culture. Tactical, set at either a project or process level usually. An example is noise elimination to prevent hearing loss. Operational, that's set at the activity level. Minimizing chemical industry stored in the workplace as an example. So that there's overall project process and then at the actual what we're doing on a day-to-day. So there's multiple levels that the objectives can fall under. Objectives an organization can plan to achieve these objectives individually or collectively. So it means you can have one person assigned to it, or you can have the organization as a whole, certain project management teams, and the organization might need to develop more formal project plans for complex objectives with multiple tasks. Organizations should always look at the resources required, and by that we talk about the costs, human capital, and also, infrastructure for those tasks to be performed. The organization should assign responsibility and completion dates for tasks to ensure that the objectives can be accomplished within the overall time frame. When practical, each objective should be associated with an indicator, which can be strategical, tactical, or operational. Clause 7 talks about support. So in that, we get into resources, competence, awareness, communication, and documentation. Those 5 main areas, when we talk about resources, as we said, they're the human resources, they're the capital resources, they may be natural resources, technology, finance, all those resources that may be required for a system to comply. Competence. So it looks at, that's really training. That how are you deeming people competent to look at the hazards and risks of their work and be aware of them and protect them. Awareness. This is where we talked about as well about emergency processes, the consequences of actions relative to the risk, the benefit of improved performance, need to comply with procedures, and similar. Communication. Information must be communicated throughout the organization and, where appropriate, to external parties as well. Documented. Documented information on the actions by the organization to achieve compliance must be kept. Now, one of the things that when we talk about documentation that is somewhat new to the revised ISO standards, that there's not a specific documentation requirement as there was in previous standards, where it's you needed a formal manual and then processes, policies, procedures, work instructions, all these things to formally document and show that you're in compliance. It doesn't say that in the standard that you need these particular documents, but it does say that the evidence has to be documented in some way, shape, or form that can show the objective evidence that you're in compliance to this and that you're doing what you say you do, essentially, and you can prove it. Clause 8 is operation, and that gets into planning, controls, emergency response, outsourcing, and procurement. So this is what we say this is definitely the do part of the Plan, Do, Check, Act. Operational planning and controls. They should be established and implemented as necessary to eliminate hazards or at least manage risks to an acceptable level. Priority, of course, should be given to options with high reliability in preventing injury or, ill health. So the methods for that is typically, procedures for the work you're doing, ensuring competency, as we talked about competency and training, establishing preventative, predictive maintenance and inspection plans, looking at the actual equipment, making sure that, one of the things that we do, we inspect the tolerances in the machine, we inspect this to make sure that there's no chance, for things breaking and causing potential injury to someone. Compliance to the regulations and manufacturer's instructions for how you're doing actual business, that there are requirements to say, this is how you should be operating machinery, and that you're putting that into your planning and control, saying we need to make sure that we're actually following it. Developing and implementing emergency response plans. So this looks at, what are the types of emergency situations are there? What's the scale of them? Then once you're looking at them, what's the appropriate response method? What actions are then required to minimize the potential damage for those situations? Outsourcing and procurement. So this talks about outsourced processes. So an outsourced process is one that the function or processes is integral to the organization's functioning. It's also needed for the management system to achieve its intended outcome. Liability for conforming to the requirements is retained by the organization, and the organization and the external provider have an integral relationship. Procurement controls should ensure that laws, regulations, and the organization requirements are identified prior to the procurement of goods and services, so that the equipment is delivered according to the specifications, tested to work as intended, installations are commissioned to function as designed, and materials that are delivered according to the specifications and requirements. Performance and evaluation. Gets into monitoring and measuring, frequency, internal audits, and of course, management review. Performance and evaluation. Talked about, the controls and monitoring capabilities are in place. Once again, it's like, what are we measuring? How are we measuring it? Where are we measuring it? When are we measuring it? That we're talking about being actionable, time-sensitive, and having metrics to always look at. The criteria. Another thing, too, in determining the monitoring and the controls and monitoring capabilities in place is thinking, what areas are we going to look at within our system that is going to provide the most useful information for our controls? The criteria. So criteria can be benchmarks against other organizations, standards and codes that are already out there. Your own objectives are possible. Methods, as we talked about, monitoring, measurement, analysis, evaluation. So frequency. So the frequency of your performance and evaluation, it should be appropriate to the size and nature of the organization and risk factors. As far as internal audits, all areas should be reviewed at least once a year. When we talk about management review, we're looking at all these areas in our management review. Is this suitable? Is what we're doing right for the organization's goals? Adequacy. Are these sufficient to meet the requirement? And then, of course, effectiveness. Are these activities realized and the results achieved? Are we getting our actual outcomes from what we're putting forward in our evaluation of our system, our monitoring, our measurement, and our review? Clause 10 gets into improvements. That's incidents, nonconformities, corrective action, continual improvement. Incident, nonconformity, and corrective action. So separate processes may exist for incident investigations and nonconformities. It's dependent on the organizational requirements. But some examples may include, but are not limited to, incidents. That's where we're really looking at occupational related events, injuries, health exposures to hazardous health hazards, accidents, property and equipment damage, anything that can lead to a risk. Nonconformities, that might be an area where protective equipment is not functioning properly, or noncompliance to legal requirements, or prescribed procedures not being followed. Corrective action, elimination of hazards, substitution to safe materials, design or modification to equipment or tools, development of procedures, training to affected workers, changes in frequency of use, or use of personal protective equipment. Continual improvement. This is a great thing that it's like continual improvement is meant to be step-by-step approach over time, and it's focused on future health and safety performance. That continual improvement is not a one-time event. Continual improvement is, always ongoing. You're always looking at the issues to be reviewed, and some of the areas that you would look at: new technology, suggestions from interested parties, newer improved materials that may help your management systems performance, practices of other organizations. A great way is really talking with other organizations in a similar industry, or just looking at what they do for their management systems, even if they're not in the industry. That a lot of times best practice can be shared across multiple disciplines. The knowledge and understanding of health and safety related issues. These issues can change over time. So it's always meant that, are we current? Are we looking at what the most current issues are? Changes in the workforce capabilities or competence that, we do have workforces that are changing, we're bringing new people into the workforce every year, and how do these new people that are taking over functions or training under people, are we looking at what they do as well, in the context of our management system and how that may affect it. So getting into, so that's the clauses of the standard. Transition tips, and we're going to be sending out some document with some transition tips as well with the presentation. One of the first thing is appointing a staff. Who is responsible for the transition? Very similar to what we said, that having people assigned, having target dates, and having clear metrics. Train staff. Now, there's a lot of things out there for training, but I would be remiss, even if it's a gratuitous plug, for our sister organization, AQS Solutions, which is one of the oldest and most respected management system training companies out there. They have a variety of training on ISO 45001. Lead auditor, they have a couple classes scheduled already in Minneapolis, Anna, and Tampa. Internal auditor. Path forward. Path forward is, okay, you have an 18001. How are you looking to transition to a 45001? Understanding and implementing. Diving a lot deeper in 1 to 2 days from where we did today, just in an overview, to really drilling down into these clauses and their intent and what that means. Identifying the deltas. As we already talked about, some of the things that are new to ISO 45001 or have at least changed from 18001 is the addition of context organization. We talked about risk-based approach. Now, obviously, when you're looking at your aspects and, your risks and hazards, that's part of, the risk of the company, but it's really putting in there more language on what the risk-based approach is. Are you model to the plan, do, check, act model? Your management, we talked about what leadership is required from leadership now and what's changed. Process management, how do you manage a change in the process, and are you looking at the interested parties? Then you need to create an action plan. As we said, what's the time frame? Who's involved? What's required? Time sensitive, what are the resources? What are the measurables and metrics that we're looking at? Update your existing system. Once the staff is trained and you have the deltas analyzed, use that to update the system, processes, and procedures. Train your internal auditors. Organization determines the requirements. And what that means is there is nothing in the standard that says you must be trained this way. Organization themselves determine what is appropriate for them. Now, one of the questions you'll get on an audit is, why did you determine that was appropriate? And, that's up to the organization. It just has to be justified that we determined this was the best way to move forward. Internally assess the effectiveness of the system. So do an internal audit, ensure the requirements have been met and evaluated, and then determine your transition date. So this is really working with your current certification body. The one thing I always say for companies that are looking to transition, whether it's to essentially a new standard like the OHSAS 18001 to ISO 45001, or a new version of the standard like an ISO 9001 2008 to 9001 2015, is work with your current certification body. That you don't have to go alone. Reach out, talk to them, get input, and work together on setting forth a plan that makes sense for the timelines both of your company and also the timelines set forth by the standard. So thank you for that. So now we're going to go into some of the questions here. I will pull those up. Sorry, I'm just
Chris, we had a question from one of the attendees. If you could sum up in a few sentences why this certification is beneficial for an organization, what would you say that is, other than just it's good to have it? You know, what benefits can an organization find from being certified to ISO 45001?
I think the biggest benefit is really having another set of eyes look at your system, that it's very easy to, like I mentioned before, go into groupthink. You know, it's kind of sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees that, you know, we talk about in the standard, getting everyone's buy-in within the company, but also having people who are looking at it from a fresh perspective to your organization, but also with a very experienced point of view in these areas, so that it's, you know, we're talking about the health and safety of people, which is obviously important, obviously because the risk within that can be incredibly significant if you don't. So I really think having that just kind of prevents the, you know, kind of, oh yeah, we're fine, we've claimed our own compliance, all that. I think having that, having someone come in, and the benefit of having someone come in too, that it's like, you know, speaking for ourselves, when we come in for third-party certification, we're not just looking for compliance. Yes, compliance is the main thing. It's an audit based on compliance. But we're also looking to say, where are the opportunities for improvement? How can we take what you've done and give you some ideas to help fix, make your system more effectiveness? So it's just a larger quantity of information on how to run your system, I think is probably the biggest benefit. And also, it makes you more diligent about it, that if you actually have people coming in at a set interval to review your system, you're going to be more diligent about actually running it, following up, and doing all the necessary things to make it work and keep your people safe.
Okay, great. We had another one about, and I think you touched on it a little bit, but they wanted to know a little bit more about how ISO 45001 can fit in with other standards like ISO 9001 or 14001. For example, the common areas that they have, like the clause 4, will they need to address that separately, or can they use a lot of the information that was identified for their 9001 system?
Yeah, so you can use a lot of the information or infrastructure, you know, processes, procedures, whatever you want to say. For example, for Section 4, that you can do, you know, you can still do management review as you would, internal audits as you would, corrective action, all those type of things. You would just add that focus of not just looking at, let's say, quality items. You'd also add things as it pertains specifically to health and safety. And that was one of the things that really the biggest thing with this is, like I said, with the system, the new structure really was designed so that you don't have to do management review a different way for every standard you're certified to, that you can really take these and make these a business management system rather than just a health and safety or just a quality management system.
Okay, and we had another question. Is it a requirement of the standard to have internal audits done annually?
What was that?
Is it required by the standard to have an annual internal audit?
Yeah, at a minimum, internal audit. You can do more, you know, and many companies do, but the requirement of the standard is at a minimum annually.
Okay, great. And a lot of people we did have asking about the slide decks. We will be sending those out to you along with a recording of the presentation tomorrow. We had another question about how long is the certification process?
So the actual certification process, so talking just from I guess I'll talk about it from 2 points of view. Obviously, one is from when you decide to go forward to when you get an audit. that varies for every company. That varies depending on size, what things you already have in place, what resources and experience you have to do that. So that can be, as short as a couple months or as long as a year. The actual certification process, as far as coming in and having an organization like DECRA come in and audit you, typically for companies, we have a stage 1, which is looking at the readiness of the company to move forward. So that's looking at how you do your management review. Do you have your processes in place? What are your controls? Have you done a risk assessment? Have you done internal audits and all that? So looking at the bigger ticket items of the standard and say, okay, are we ready to go into stage 2, which dives deeper into all the clauses, the requirements, basically how you put these things in action. So typically audits are scheduled a couple months in advance once you're ready. And the time required does vary, for organizations. There's guide documents that all the certification bodies have to follow that determine time required based on a number of factors, including size of the organization, scope of activities, if they do have other management systems in place as well.
Okay, great. And we had another question regarding the training that you had mentioned by AQS in ISO 45001. We had some questions about the different courses. So, and the cost thereof. We have the ISO 45001 Certified Lead Auditor Training. That's a 5-day course. It is $18.95 is the base price, and there are some available discounts for multiple registrations as well as advanced registrations if you're looking at one of the ones in August or October in Santa Ana or Tampa. There are available advanced registration discounts, and we'll definitely send out some information on that. And then we also have the other one that Chris had mentioned, Auditor Transition Training and the Path Forward. Those are 2-day courses. We have them lining up in the same cities in Minneapolis, Santa Ana, and Tampa, and those are $9.95 for the 2-day course, and there are discounts available for that as well.
And and then I think Internal Auditor has a 3-day option as well. And some of these, there is a mix of public and we also have the ability to do on-site. So a lot of times the on-site training can combine different modules of that as well. That you could combine the internal auditor with kind of the path forward, similar ideas too. And we had another question from an attendee. Can a very small company, say under 10 employees, get certified in ISO 45001? And if so, would it make sense to do so in an office setting? Yeah, a small company can definitely do so. There's no restrictions on the size of the company. Does it make sense to do so? I think that's a question that I always say, it's really aligned with the objectives of your organization. Obviously, having worked in this industry for 18 years, there's a part of me that says yes, but it has to make sense. It has to make sense with your objectives and what you're trying to do. And whether it's an office environment and manufacturing, there's still, the health and safety issues of your people that you want to be addressing, regardless of where you're at and what you're doing as an organization.
Another question we had here, what would you define as the difference between risks and opportunities? If you identify a risk, does it then become an opportunity?
It can. If you identify, risks are things that have a potential to adversely affect your company or the performance of your system. Opportunities are areas where you can improve your system. Now, within that risk, depending on the nature of the risk, you might find additional opportunities within that, depending on how you want to address it and reduce the risk.
Another question here is, do we recommend working with a consultant before entering the certification process with a CEB like DECRA?
I would say that consultants can be very, very valuable because these are people who have a high degree of knowledge in these areas, and they really understand how to work with companies that have nothing in place to full compliance or have a lot of the things that they're already doing, and then just helping them bridge those gaps, fill in those gaps where they need to do more and to bring it into compliance. I think it's always good to have a consultant or at least have someone with experience in these systems to really kind of help guide that. So I think consultants are a great resource for companies to use, especially if this is your first time dealing with this. If you have if you're not that familiar, or just you want, as I said, you want someone to bounce ideas off, that we as a third party, we can't help you to the level of saying, oh, do this. We can give interpretations and things if you have questions on, does this meet the intent, similar to that, but we can't actually hold your hand and say, this is what you need to do to get from where you're at to where you need to be, as a consultant can.
And one final question here we had, are there any prerequisites for the AQS lead auditor training courses?
No.
All right, great. And we did have quite a few other questions here, but since we are running towards the end of our time, what we'll do is get those answered and include them with the presentation that we're going to send out tomorrow to all of you by email. And you can feel free to share that with anyone as well, obviously. As Chris mentioned towards the beginning, we're going to have a specific webinar later this summer on the transition specifically from OHSAS 18001 to ISO 45001. And we'll make sure that all of you get an invitation for that as well once the date is set and we have all the details. But that one's going to go a little more in depth on the transition process from OHSAS to the ISO 45001. So we just want to thank you all for attending the webinar today. And like we said, we'll be following up with you with all the information from this webinar, as well as the questions that we weren't able to answer before the end of our time today. Have a great day, everyone.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.